Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman of Temple B'nai Jeshurun, and I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines. And Mark, there are all kinds of things going on.
Pick one.
Where do we want to start?
How about
here?
with the close sea, the smuggling of the ammunition?
The Iranian weapons?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's not the first time that this has happened. The Karine A, for instance, was intercepted many years ago. The question is, did the Iranians expect this particular ship to be intercepted or not?
Well, it sounds to me like they didn't, that they were trying to do this just very calmly under the radar, and that it came from Syria. It didn't come directly from Iran. The weapons were shipped from Syria. The weapons were going to go through Port Sudan, which is where they normally go, and that they were going to then end up in Gaza. At least that's the explanation. Now, there's several different possibilities even from that. Were these weapons intended for Hamas, or were they intended for Islamic Jihad, to try to have Islamic Jihad start a conflict with Israel separate from Hamas?
Before we talk about some of those unknowns, look, the damage that could be done by these particular weapons is linked to the fact that they're longer range than most weapons.
Longer range and much more substantial.
And the longer range means greater penetration into Israeli population centers, such as Tel Aviv.
Yeah, I mean, it could certainly hit major cities like Tel Aviv, and it could do a lot of damage when they get there. And the Israelis obviously have to take it very seriously. The other thing is these weapons could be used anywhere else. It's not like they could only be used against Israel. So the whole idea of smuggling them is very problematic. We also don't know where they were going. Is it possible that they were intended for another place other than Gaza? It's really questionable because the Israelis and the U.S. both have significant military intelligence that says it's exactly what they were doing, that they were trying to get the stuff there.
Yeah, the issue, though, is that there was no international hue and cry when the boat was intercepted in international waters. What do you make of that?
What I think is that people are sick and tired of discussing it, and I think part of that is that they don't want to admit that Iran is not nice, and making a big deal out of the fact that we're negotiating a nuclear deal with a country that is trying to ship longer range missiles in to start a war. That's a problem. The fact that Iran is involved in this Malaysian Air thing with false passports and things like that. Now, granted, these people may have been trying to defect from Iran, in which case they were good guys defecting from the bad guys, or it could be that that's a cover story for what they were really trying to do, and we don't know. But Iran seems to be involved in all kinds of different things that are all problematic.
Is this tied together with not wanting, for instance, the United States Congress to pass legislation to promulgate greater sanctions contingent upon Iran messing up?
Well, I mean, look, here's the deal. We're talking about Iranian sanctions on Iran, specifically dealing with the nuclear program. Why aren't we dealing with sanctions on Iran, dealing with all of their behavior in the Middle East? I mean, if it were me and I was going to put sanctions on a country actually acting hostile and smuggling weapons to Hamas, should in and of itself trigger sanctions. There should be sanctions specifically dealing with that.
Yeah,
they shouldn't be exempt from anything else simply because we're in the midst of nuclear negotiations with them.
Unpack, though, the thinking behind not wishing to rock the boat any further.
Look, we have a situation in which Iran has convinced people convince this administration and convince some of the European leaders that it's willing to be nice, and all it's doing is seeking peaceful nuclear power. It's entirely possible that they are only seeking peaceful nuclear power. You can do a lot of damage with peaceful nuclear power. You can create dirty bombs. You can escalate your program fairly quickly once you reach a certain threshold. And you're a threshold nuclear state. It doesn't take you very long to get to nuclear power, to nuclear weapons, I mean.
But the negotiating stance we're talking about is to seem to say, put all this on the back burner, let's not force them away from the table. What type of validity does that have in terms of negotiations?
Well, I think unless the other side feels threatened, there's no negotiation. I don't think there is a negotiation. If there's no consequence for failing to make a deal, you're not going to have any incentive to make a deal.
I think that's 2 carts down the road, though, because people would argue if we scare them away now, there will definitely not be a deal. And it'll be our fault because we scared them away.
Scare them away from what?
From the table. But there's some idea out there that people have that we have to refrain from brandishing the stick, because if we do, then the Iranians will claim we're not negotiating in good faith.
The only reason that we should refrain from brandishing the stick is because we don't have a stick. If you say, here's my stick, and it's actually a wet noodle, you don't really have much of an argument. If the reality is that there is no military option on the table, which I think the Iranians believe, that there's no military option on the table, and we threaten a military option that we have no intention or ability to do, then what you end up with is us looking silly and like we don't mean anything, in which case there's no incentive for them to negotiate.
But that's not the American point of view. There are plenty of people who believe that America still would keep all actions on the table. And because the administration keeps saying it's kept all actions on,
just saying you're keeping. I mean, look, the people who want to hear that all possibilities are on the table are the Israelis.
Right.
That statement is specifically for the Israelis, to keep the Israelis from launching a military action against Iran, which I'm not sure that the Israelis could do anyway. And it's also to appease the conservatives of the Democratic Party, who are pushing the president. The Republicans are largely irrelevant to pushing the president at this point. They don't have enough force. But the conservatives in the Democratic Party do, because if they join with the Republicans, then they can actually do some policy damage to the president. You know, if you have enough Democrats siding with the Republicans, they can pass legislation that would overcome a veto.
Right.
So the president's concern is people like Senator Menendez, who's a Democrat, who could potentially side with the Republicans against him. So a lot of the language is really aimed at those conservative Democrats.
It's appeasement of some,
and against the Israelis. And
yeah.
You want to try to change policy. That's really what this is about. So saying that all options are on the table doesn't mean that actually all options are on the table.
Well, that may be
telling what people want to hear.
But isn't it conceivable that the administration really believes that they still have a military option on the table?
They do have a military option. I mean, eventually they do. The question is it feasible that we could dismantle the entire Iranian nuclear program? The answer is probably no. Is it feasible that we could go after specific parts of the military program? The answer is yes. Would Iran then try to hide new nuclear facilities for which we would not threaten military action, either because we wouldn't know them or because we wouldn't want to stake that much political capital on doing it again? So what ends up happening is Iran has quote-unquote secret nuclear facilities that are no longer secret.
Right.
But it could be creating new secret ones, and if we don't have access to find out where they are, one, that's a problem because we couldn't do anything with them. If we don't have inspectors in them, we can't do anything. I mean, I tend to think that the argument is, the real argument is that we don't have the will to do what would need to be done as an alternative to negotiations or sanctions.
Well, we know that because we keep hearing that Americans are tired of war and tired of being in the Middle East, and therefore the general consensus says we should not get involved. But that's not what the administration is saying.
Well, look, to look at this situation and pretend that the impact is primarily or solely going to be on Israel is absurd.
Right.
Right. That's the other thing that the American population needs to understand. The European population, I think, needs to understand it even more. And the Arab world certainly gets it. The primary target of Iranian power is not Israel or the United States. It's the Sunni Muslim nations. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are two of the major targets if Iran gets to the point where it can't be attacked. If we're dealing with an Iran that people even think has nuclear power,
yes,
no one's going to really be able to militarily do anything to Iran, and Iran can extend its conventional weapons power, whether that's terrorists or missiles or anything else, around the region, and no one's going to mess with it, which means that at that point, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and any number of these other countries not only need nuclear power, they then need to also be able to threaten nuclear weapons.
And that puts us into a new arms race.
That's the arms race. That's
right.
Where we are. That is one of the major threats of this situation.
Let me.
And Europe right now is also a huge issue because. If those weapons get in the hands of terrorists, it's far less likely that they're going to cross the Atlantic Ocean and come to the United States than it is that they're going to walk across land into Europe.
Sure. Two words for you to react to. The first is Parchin, and the second is containment. Are we on the edge of containment?
Well, I think the whole concept of a containment has already been proven false. You can't contain. So when people say that that containment is not an option, it may be because they don't believe it's possible, not that they don't believe it's the best policy. I mean, look, are we containing North Korea? No. The technology has gotten out all over the place. We're certainly not containing Pakistan as a nuclear power. And if Iran gets nuclear weapons, we're already there. I mean, you're already dealing with a situation which containment may not be an option because it's not possible, not because it's not the best option. So we can't let it get to the point where we're even thinking about it. And that's the difference between capability and having a nuclear weapon. And the difference between the argument for the Israelis and the position of the United States, which is why the position of the United States is so frustrating to the Israelis. You can't contain a nuclear-capable nation any more than you can contain one with a weapon.
So it's capability that's really the line in
capability
the
is absolutely the line, because what happens if Saudi Arabia says we're going to create nuclear power plants, we're going to have our own nuclear program, and we're going to take it to the same threshold the Iranians are at. And then at some point in time, some group in Saudi Arabia says, you know what, we don't like the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia. We're going to work with the Iranians to try to overthrow the government there. And the best way for us to do that is to threaten nuclear technology. Who knows?
Okay, the second point is Parchin. How important is it to include Parchin, the military secret base, in any additional talks? And what's really there that can do harm?
Look, again, we don't even know what's where. I mean, you're dealing to a certain extent with the Iraq question, which is how much of this is propaganda designed to make enemies afraid, and how much of it is actually what's there. For Iran to say, we don't really have anything going on in Parchin, wink, wink, they get people to start thinking that there's something going on in Parchin. And then people start worrying that Iran is much further advanced in its weapons program than it actually is. And the problem with that is the impact policy-wise is the same as if they're there.
It's the same. The question, though, are you not convinced that they have developed ICBMs?
Of course they have. Look, I think they have all the technology they need to create a nuclear weapon. I think the only thing they need to do is enrich material and prepare a bomb.
And so do you think...
And I think the Israelis are fairly clear on that, too. They have the guidance, they have the weapons, they have everything they need.
So is the...
And they certainly have the education and the understanding. It's not like they're lacking the scientific aptitude to do this.
So in negotiating the final outcome of this, we keep hearing that the Iranians will be accorded a certain level of enrichment.
Well, and the question really is, do we need to restrict enrichment, or do we need to pretend that we're egalitarian and every country can, or even act that we're egalitarian and that every country should have access to a peaceful nuclear program? I mean, the countries that want to have access to the peaceful nuclear program are the ones who actually want to threaten U.S. and Western power. I mean, let's be serious about this. The fact that the overwhelming majority of the UN nations would advocate for that position is not evidence that it's a good position. It's evidence that they're jealous and that they want that. The question is whether or not the West should be willing to allow it.
Well, people have stated that in order to have a civilian nuclear program, you don't need enrichment.
You don't need any domestic production at all. You could have that. You could have the West and Russia and China produce plenty of material to be used in all the nuclear plants around the world for long time to come.
So this doubles back on the original question regarding American strategy. Are we overly concerned about hurting the pride of the Iranians?
Well, I think to a certain extent we are, and I think to a certain extent there's this belief that the United States doesn't actually lead, and we have no right to lead. We have no right to control the other countries. We have no right to limit their military capability and their growth. And
now,
if you want,
who is it believes that?
I think the president believes.
The president believes it. He has no right to lead on
I
this
think
issue?
I think the president said that in that original UN speech in 2009 when he was saying that peaceful nuclear power is fine. And that, we have no right to determine, what other countries do. I think the reality is that put into a nuclear containment policy, which is functionally what we're dealing with, is containing not only the Iranian nuclear program, but any other nuclear program that could start to develop, not as weapons programs, but just as nuclear power programs, is a nightmare for nuclear proliferation. Because what it means is any one of those countries, once they get a full-blown nuclear program where they're enriching their own material, could overnight turn into a threshold nuclear weapons state and then move to nuclear weapons. And, there's a lot of instability in this region, and there are a lot of people who would be willing to use weapons against others. From what we've seen, it's very clear that Muslim-on-Muslim violence is the primary target.
Absolutely.
And so the people who are most concerned about this are not Europe and the United States, nor Israel. They're really the people who are most concerned about this are the other Muslim countries, whose security is nowhere close to what Israel's is, and who are clearly threatened by all these groups.
Let me see if we could tack this on to a discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Now, we've heard in the past, this is a particularly good time for it because we have leverage, because it's a stable region, because it's an unstable region. What is the best reason for pushing forward with a peace process at this time?
Well, I think from my point of view, the Israelis are capable right now, if the Palestinians made them a reasonable offer, to...
so this is a good time for certain reasons.
I think the Israelis are in a position to accept a reasonable Palestinian offer of what they would take in order to be allowed to have a state. I mean, that's functionally what's dealing here.
Because the electorate is in line with this?
Because the Israeli electorate is overwhelmingly in favor of it, and the Israelis are no longer in need of natural gas from Egypt.
Yeah.
They no longer have a water issue. They could provide water and natural gas for the whole Palestinian population with no problem. And functionally, their security situation, with the exception of the threat from Iran and potential threat from whatever happens in Syria and Lebanon, is as good as it's been in a long time.
And it's not going to get any better?
So I don't know that it can get better than really, potentially. I mean, unless you had unless Iran turns into a Western-style democracy overnight, there's not really a whole lot that can happen to make it a lot better than it is. The Israelis have good cooperation with Egypt right now. They've got good cooperation with Jordan right now, even though there's some tensions because of an issue that happened a couple days ago with a Jordanian who was killed. Jordanian Palestinian who was killed, and there certainly is a lot of instability in Jordan. I mean, one of Israel's primary realistically, its primary strategic concern is stability in Jordan.
Turn back to the smuggling issue again.
Yeah.
It puts Israel sort of like on a horn of a dilemma, does it not? Does it do the job and stop the terrorism, stop the rockets? Does it pretend?
I mean, the smuggling into Gaza,
and
right now,
the smuggling and the rocketry.
Right now, you also have an interesting issue in that one of the major targets of any weaponry in Gaza is going to be Egypt. And the Egyptians are even more concerned about that kind of weaponry and other kind of weaponry getting into the hands of terrorists who are trying to harm them. You basically got a full-blown war between Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, not only in Egypt but also in Gaza, and that's Hamas. So the Egyptians are not particularly the Egyptians are just as concerned about hardcore weaponry in Sinai as they are in Gaza.
But with regard to the negotiation process where it is right now, what is you hinted at it before? What is the strategy of the people who are destabilizing things by both issues? Well, the smuggling and the rocketry.
You've got a number of different things going on. One is that there's a possibility that the negotiations with Iran collapse, that Iran doesn't concede anything. The U.S. and Europe throw up their arms and say, well, you haven't conceded enough, and Israel says it's time to strike.
But that's not going to happen for a while.
We don't know when it's going to happen. We really don't know when it's going to happen. But it could also be, or that the United States decides it's time to strike. And the United States is going to take out certain strategic installations and then negotiate again. Well, it could be that Iran was positioning to retaliate, positioning weaponry in Gaza to retaliate. It's also possible that Iran is very worried that that the people in Gaza are losing weaponry because they're having to fend off the Egyptians. And that they needed to resupply Gaza to fight the Egyptians, not that they needed to resupply Gaza to fight the Israelis. The long-range weapons are a different issue because the long-range weapons, obviously are intended for Israel. But a lot of the shorter-range stuff in the bullets may be just as much intended to go after the Egyptians as to go after the Israelis, because the Egyptians have threatened invasion of Gaza too.
Right.
So there are a number of things going on here. One, you've got this issue of anything happening to Iran, the result being attack from Gaza. You've got another issue of anything happening in Syria being an attack from Gaza, because in Syria, Syrians haven't turned over most of the chemical weapons. Surprise, surprise, nothing's happened there, and nothing's going to happen there. We have complained about it. There's nothing going to be ongoing. And the situation there is frankly deteriorating with Al-Qaeda everywhere. And people still dying in large numbers. I mean, that situation has not been handled at all. Iran could potentially look at a situation in which the West decides that they need to act in Syria finally, in which case then it would want a retaliation from Gaza too. So those are two different scenarios that don't involve the peace process at all,
right?
Involving Gaza. Then there's the idea that, well, wait a minute, what if the United States and the Palestinians and the Israelis are actually getting closer because the United States really is pressuring the Palestinians, not just pressuring the Israelis, but actually pressuring the Palestinians, saying we're going to either let Israel unilaterally do what it's going to do in the long run if you don't agree to something now, or they're going to force an agreement down the throats of the Palestinians, granted also forcing it down the Israeli throat, that is not what anybody can agree to. And all of a sudden, you've got stability for Israel, which would be a nightmare for Iran. Because if Israel, as Benjamin Netanyahu said, if Israel can provide gas and water to the rest of the Arab world, all of a sudden the rest of the Arab world is going to greatly increase. I mean, economically, that would be a huge boom for the rest of the Arab world.
Right. And
that would be a huge threat to Iran.
Yeah.
So it's possible that they're trying to undermine any of those.
Right. Let me ask you, what has been Mahmoud Abbas's impressions about, number one, the smuggling, number two, the rocketry, number three, Iran?
I think that Abbas has a number of different problems. I think the first problem is he doesn't want to take responsibility for anything that Hamas does. First of all, I don't think he has any control over it. And I don't think that he wants to pretend that he does, because if he says that he can stop it and he can't stop it, he just proves himself impotent. So he's at best trying to ignore it and trying to speak for the Palestinian people, even though he was elected years ago for a term that expired years ago, and clearly does not represent a significant portion of the population even then. So.
But he's coming out with statements basically accusing Israel of its retaliation, harsh retaliation for the rocketry. He probably said something like, "You're making propaganda out of the interception of the."
So you got there are a couple different things. One, he's got to speak to his domestic audience. Okay, I mean, he's speaking to Palestinians, not just in the Palestinian territories, but also whether you're dealing with in Palestine, which functionally is actually going to be the West Bank, or you're dealing with Gaza, or you're dealing with Palestinians in Syria, or you're dealing with Palestinians in Jordan. They don't want to hear that Abbas has no control over Gaza, and it doesn't matter what he does. It's a problem. He's got to speak out as if he's representing the people in Gaza, even though everybody knows he's not representing the people in Gaza, because otherwise he looks like he's negotiating for a fraction of the people that he actually is negotiating for. I mean, you got to remember, think about this, Mark. He's negotiating right now solely for the population that is in the West Bank. Right? That's a small fraction of the actual Palestinian population worldwide. We're dealing with, what, a fifth of the Palestinian population worldwide? And after any peace agreement, there's no chance that the vast majority of those people could come into the West Bank.
Right. Well,
they're not going to. The Palestinian, the West Bank population, the West Bank couldn't sustain that. Even if they got all the land from 1967 and Gaza completely under control, it still couldn't sustain the population that they're talking about.
We and others have talked about that before. Why isn't this evident to somebody like Secretary of State Kerry, who simply is going ahead and trying to staple?
Because if you want to, because the best way to ensure that you have mass rioting all over the place is to bring it up. I mean, if the Palestinians were to say, if Palestinian Authority were to say, not only is there no right of return to Israel, but there's going to be no right of return to the West Bank either, because we just can't sustain the population. You got all these people living in refugee camps in Syria and Jordan that aren't going to be accommodated anywhere. What happens then? I mean, Yarmouk in Syria, where they're being attacked and now turned into a dhimmi population by an al-Qaeda group, they're going to be stuck there forever?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality is that.
Well, doesn't this have any impact on Kerry's thought process? Or he has to be processing it somehow.
I think it does.
Okay.
But the problem is there's no solution that doesn't involve the Palestinians simply conceding it. The Israelis can't do anything about that. They're not going to bring in large numbers of people, and the vast majority of these people can't be accommodated by the Palestinian Authority either. So what has to happen is that Kerry's going to have to say the Israelis won't allow millions of Palestinians to come into the West Bank, right? Because he can't make it Abbas's point of view that can't happen, because he'd be attacked by his own people if that happened. So you got to make it either the U.S.'s argument that it can't happen, or it's got to be Israel's argument that it can't happen.
And it's easier to make it Israel's argument.
But meanwhile, you would destabilize Jordan very quickly,
right?
Because a lot of the people in Jordan are only not challenging for the leadership of Jordan because they believe they're going to end up in a Palestinian state. If they're told they're not going to end up in a Palestinian state, suddenly that whole dynamic changes. And it could change in Syria too, if you end up with that being the case. So I mean, let's go to Jewish state. Okay. Let's talk for a minute about Hussein Ibish's article.
Hussein Ibish from the American Task Force on Palestine.
This is an article that was come from Media, M Media. I don't know, was it Mobile Media, Mideast Media? I don't even know what the site is, but M Media and it's been circulated by a number of progressives who are upset with Benjamin Netanyahu's demand that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. So what's the issue, Mark?
There's first of all an issue of reality to figure out why some people can't figure out that Israel depends on its enemy accepting it as the nation state of the Jewish people for real reasons, as opposed to either imaginary or impediment reasons. Would you think that's part of it?
I mean, I think there's a desire to be respected by the other side, and to have this be
it's more than that.
We're going to play in the same tent. And
I was referring more to looking at Netanyahu is by definition bad, and therefore his concern with this issue only is superficiary and intended to serve as an artificial impediment.
Intended to derail the peace process. Yeah. I mean, I think that is the assumption. I think the argument from the Israeli side is much more substantial than that, and I think the opposition is being silly.
Yeah.
The argument that's being made is that the Palestinians recognized Israel in 1993. What's the issue? Well, first of all, recognizing Israel as a state, period, with no other qualifications is silly.
Now, I'm surprised, for instance, they put it back only to 93. They usually put it back to 1988.
However you want to do it, it's still silly, because the issue is that was never an issue. Is anybody questioning whether or not Israel's a state?
No. State per se, right.
Well, it's a silly argument. You could say we stopped fighting against Israel, but recognizing Israel as a state is useless. That doesn't help any of the peace process whatsoever.
So you strip that away and you get down to the next level. What type of state are we dealing with?
The issue of Jewish state is not about the nature of the state of Israel either. The issue of Jewish state has to do with the fact that you're supposed to have a two-state solution, where one state is a Palestinian state and one state is a state for the Jews. And if that's not what you're recognizing, you're not recognizing anything that's going to be helpful for the peace process.
But that's often the case of the people that we deal with. We keep telling them we need a win-win situation. And the only win-win situation is if there's a two states for two peoples solution.
Yeah, but see, the issue. I mean, I think that's true, Mark. But I think the issue is specific to 2 points.
Okay.
Which is the Palestinians continue to insist on the right of return of Palestinian refugees to Israel, and there's this belief that they will continue to insist on land and other things after a peace agreement. And the issue that has come up is that the right of return was such a toxic issue for the Palestinian Authority to deal with. It could not address it. It could not just concede it. There's far too many people who would demand that, no matter what happens in the process, and therefore they changed the language. The whole Jewish state concept appears, I think, as a way to avoid discussing right of return. That if Israel is a Jewish state or a state for the Jewish people, it means that the Palestinians are not going to return there. In other words, it is a way to reframe the argument about the right of return in such a way that the Palestinians can accept a Jewish state without officially denying the right of return.
Right.
Okay, and what's ended up happening here is that by attacking the Jewish state argument, they're once again bringing up the right of return, and by bringing up the right of return, they're torpedoing any possibility of a peace agreement. There's simply no way that there could be a peace agreement based on that.
I certainly see that. I think it's part of it, but there's also several other layers at the same time. One other layer is the belief that in Islamic countries who believe in Sharia, the presence of Jewish sovereignty on Islamic land is intolerable.
Look, Mark, I'm perfectly happy with that.
Okay.
I mean, I'm perfectly happy with that explanation. I don't think Israel can make peace with anybody who holds that point of view.
Well, but
and under any circumstances,
the world expects Israel to make peace with those people.
But I think if that's the argument,
as part of the argument,
I think if that is an argument in the peace process,
yes,
it cannot be dealt with. I don't think there is a solution to that argument.
But in order for that argument to surface, that issue has to be on the table.
I think that issue's been on the table for a long time. I don't think that that's really the issue.
That's part of
I do think that the Palestinian Authority and its leaders run the risk of being attacked by Al-Qaeda and people like that who would feel that way. But I don't think they can make that argument without immediately conceding everything that they've agreed to over the last 20 years and getting the U.S. Congress to say you're intractable. This is an intractable situation, and we'll allow the Israelis to do whatever they need to do.
Well, I see.
You run at that point. You really run the risk of being accused of wanting to wage war at all costs. And they would undermine their support from the left wing at that point, because then they become racist. And you cannot be religious colonializers, right? Yeah. They would go right into the religious colonializer mode if they were to actually proclaim that Islam cannot tolerate a non-Muslim ruling power. So they're avoiding that like the plague. Well, they don't have anything to do with that discussion.
They are, but one of the reasons of putting it on the table is to point out that Hamas is in the category of the eternal deniers, and we're expecting some sort of a solution that harmonizes Hamas with Fatah.
Look, I think you either make a deal, and we've talked to plenty of people who've said this. You either make a deal with the West Bank and just leave the West Bank as the West Bank, and then deal with Hamas later, or you get Hamas to agree explicitly that this is okay, in which case they undermine their position. Well, so my belief is that Hamas is not going to do the latter.
No, it's not.
And we need to stop pretending that Abbas represents Gaza.
But then we're not talking about a two-state solution. We're talking about a three-state solution.
But the issue really should be, how do we achieve peace between Israel and the Palestinians? It should not be how many states we're dealing with or in what way. I mean, another potential solution is you just say, okay, Jordan, we'll give you sovereignty over XYZ in the West Bank, and Egypt is going to get sovereignty over Gaza. And oh, by the way, they're a bigger enemy to you than they are to us. You can deal with them however you want. And unless somebody sees that as a possibility here, I mean, this gets us into Beinert's article. Unless somebody sees this as a possibility, I don't think the Palestinians have any incentive to agree to anything. There's right now, the Palestinians believe that there's no worse they can do than they currently are.
Right.
And there's no worse that they can do in the negotiating process than the last best thing they were offered.
The other thing is that if they hold out, eventually they'll get what they want.
Yeah, I mean that if you can't do worse than the last best thing you were offered, and your current situation can't deteriorate, you don't have to negotiate. So the Palestinians right now are in a position, or at least feel that they're in a position, in which they can't get any worse than they are. If in this framework agreement, the United States, or even in dealing with this framework agreement, the United States at all hints to the fact that Israel could potentially do a unilateral solution that would be worse than they currently have, much less than they're currently being offered, then they would have some incentive to actually try to negotiate.
Aren't you convinced that the administration knows that there's a possibility of some sort of unilateral action by Israel?
I don't think there is anytime soon. I don't think the Israelis would act unilaterally anytime soon. I don't think they have any incentive
3 years?
Well, the Israelis don't have any incentive to, because the problem is if they're going to face if they're going to face worse threats of economic sanctions and other things, if they actually go through with a unilateral policy, they're simply going to avoid doing that. There's no reason for them to put forth a policy unless somebody says, you know what, we'd rather have a bad Palestinian state than no Palestinian state, and we'll work with you if you unilaterally disengage. I don't think the Europeans are going to do that, in which case the situation you're in right now is a situation in which Israel doesn't feel like what would help the Palestinians would actually help it, and the Palestinians don't feel like anything that's going to move the process forward is going to help them either. and the world doesn't have any leverage. There's no leverage coming from outside. I mean, think about what economic sanctions right now against Israel are almost a joke, because everybody wants to work with Israel on virtually everything. There's more contracts coming in to work with Israel now than there are people who are even worried about working with Israel right now.
Let's go back to the Jewish state argument itself. Now, there's a division between whether it's a good strategy or not good strategy. Do you have a position on that?
As far as the Jewish state argument?
Yeah.
Like I said, I think the Jewish state is a euphemism for the end of the right of return demand by the Palestinians. And I think it was put in to enable the Palestinians to negotiate without directly addressing that. I think somebody sabotaged it, and probably it was the people who don't want a negotiation. Whether you're dealing with the people in Fatah who want to continue to fight, or you're dealing with Hamas who wants to continue to fight. Because the whole purpose of it being there, I think, at least in the negotiations, I think everybody at the table in negotiations understands perfectly well what Jewish state means. You know, Hussein Ibish is sitting there saying, oh, the Jews can't define what kind of Judaism it is. That's not what the discussion is.
You're right.
That has nothing to do with the negotiations. There's no negotiating at the table about what kind of Jewish state it is.
Because that wouldn't make any difference to, they say it would make a difference because the Palestinians say we care for our Palestinian brethren.
That's not the argument. I mean, look, the people living in Israel right now, the vast majority, even of the Muslims, much less the Christians, would much rather live in an Israel than they would live in a Palestinian state controlled by Hamas. You want to make that argument? Of course. So the issue here is everybody knows that Jewish state is a euphemism for the elimination of the right of return for Palestinians to Israel as part of the argument. The negotiators on neither side want to address that issue because it would completely torpedo the entire discussion. The United States doesn't want to address that issue because not only could it torpedo the discussion, it could inflame the whole region.
So we hear hinted, for instance, the State Department saying they're not going to pressure the Palestinians to accept literally the language of Jewish state.
Well, and the reason that they're not is because at some point somebody undermined this whole idea that it's a euphemism. They want to argue that it's saying that Israel and everybody living in it has to be Jews, and that the Jews are eternally entitled to the land from ancient history to now, and that's what it's about. It's not about that. It's really not about that. And if the Palestinians were willing to say, okay, we're giving up the right of return, the whole Jewish state argument goes out the window, I think. I don't think it even becomes part of the discussion at that point.
I think it does. I don't think it's something that can be jettisoned from the ultimate solution to the problem.
Well, look, but I think the ultimate solution to the problem is having everybody get along. But I think as far as the peace negotiations go, I think the peace negotiations have to be based on concrete things on the ground. And I think the concrete things on the ground is not recognition of Israel as a state for the Jews and the Palestinian state as a state for the Palestinians. It's a recognition that the state for the Jews is not a state for the Palestinians. As long as you recognize that Israel is not for the Palestinians, you've solved the issue. I don't care how you get there. The problem right now is that there's an assumption that Israel can be just another Palestinian state that's going to be overrun with Palestinian refugees.
Yeah. I still think that issue is still part of a larger existential reality for Israel to make sure its enemies understand it's a Jewish state. It has quite apart from the right of return issue.
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of other issues there. I just don't think that that's the primary part of the peace process. I think the negotiations aren't centered on that. I think that
because I'm not sure that Israel would give up on that. In other words, the winking that would occur if indeed Abbas says we give up on the right of return, that for that Israel would say, okay, forget about pushing forward the Jewish state issue.
Well, it's possible it wouldn't, because it's also possible that the people who are arguing for the Jewish state issue also don't want a peace agreement.
Well, no, I think there's a third quid in there. The third issue is there's a reason other than not wanting negotiations or not dealing with the right of return. It's the fact is this is the reality that has to be recognized.
You have all kinds of people. I mean, you have Lieberman who wants to export Palestinian Arabs to the Palestinian state because he's saying it's a Jewish state. His version of what that means is different than what I'm arguing. So what I'm saying is that you could certainly have people who would push recognition as a Jewish state even after the concession of right of return, but I don't think that that's the bulk of the population, is what I'm saying.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It depends how it's understood by the Israeli people.
Look, it's like you can't get people you're not going to get people to agree that the United States is a Christian nation either.
Right.
So, from our perspective, putting forth that argument is problematic when you're dealing with religion. If you're dealing with whose homeland does it belong to,
yes,
then it's a different argument. And the question is, what
import
does that argument have?
But I still think it has a lot more layers than simply the right of return.
Well, let's talk about Beinert's article real quick here. Beinert's article, Peter Beinert's article in Haaretz from the other day, essentially argues that the United States is specifically the headline. There's mounting evidence that Kerry is pushing a framework that gives Palestinians less than they were offered by Bill Clinton and Ehud Olmert.
And so Beinart basically is saying for efficiency's sake, this shouldn't happen. He's not arguing that simply the Palestinians deserve a better shake. He seems to be arguing that you don't want to go this route for its practical consequences.
Well, I mean, I think what he's arguing is the same kind of thing that our friend Gershon Baskin has argued before, which is that the negotiations should always take place where the last one's left off because you've already had a whole lot of negotiations. And this makes no sense to me. It's never made any sense to me why people don't understand that the situation changes on the ground.
Right.
And I'm not talking about expansion of settlements or anything. I'm talking about Hamas taking over Gaza, about terrorist attacks, about
this is the reality.
The situation of the Arab Spring, about the security situation in Syria and Jordan. I mean, there are any number of other situations that would affect this significantly. Also, the dynamic within the Israeli political system has changed significantly. You no longer have a left-wing government in charge.
Right. But despite those changes, there's also the assumption that those failed negotiation efforts actually agreed upon something.
Yeah.
So you can't build something that was not agreed upon before.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like negotiating the price of a house and then coming back a few years later and saying, I'd like the deal you offered me for, except better.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in any negotiation you have. You negotiate based on where things are, and the situation that they're dealing with is one in which the dynamics have changed, and the best incentive for the Palestinians to agree to any deal is that it could get worse if they don't agree.
I think Beinart sees itself. This is less of a bargain. This is less of a bargain for the Palestinians.
Look, we said in 2000 they should have accepted the deal that was on the table in 2000.
But that's not what Beinart is saying, that we are cheating the Palestinians by providing less of a bargain.
Well, I don't think we're providing less of a bargain. We're saying that this looks like the only way we're going to get anywhere. I mean, if he were to argue, if the United States were to push something further toward the Palestinian side, the Israelis would simply balk. In which case, you got no negotiation anyway. But if you don't have the Israelis involved, the other thing that people don't understand is they think that the Palestinians are controlling the discussion and the United States is forcing Israel to do something. That's not the way it's going to work. The only way you're going to have any peace here is if Israel sees more incentive to change the status quo than it does to maintain the status quo.
But this goes against the reality that it looks like the Obama administration would be glad to blame the Israelis for the lack of progress.
Well, blaming the Israelis is different than, I mean, I can see blaming the Israelis, okay? I think for a number of policy reasons, it makes sense to blame the Israelis. Because if you blame the Palestinians for the lack of process, you basically destroy the Palestinian Authority.
Right.
If the United States came out tomorrow and said the Israelis are willing to deal, the Palestinians are not, the Congress would immediately lessen the amount of money that's going to the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Europe would potentially feel compelled to do that too, in which case you collapse the Palestinian Authority. So blaming Israel may be the only way to maintain the Palestinian Authority. So I can see that happening regardless of what happens in the negotiations. And people should understand that the United States and Europe may well need to blame Israel no matter what happens in the negotiations.
Well, there must be a word for that, for blaming somebody
who doesn't deserve it.
Who doesn't deserve it. It's called scapegoating.
Yes, there's a word for that. It's called scapegoating, and Jews have had that for years.
Yeah.
But that's exactly the situation we're in. Next week is spring break. We're going to take the week off. We don't have a show next week. And the week after, we'll be back. And I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about because things seem to be changing very rapidly. I'd like to thank our sponsor for this show, Dr. Ronald Bergman of Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa. And I'd like to thank Temple B'nai Jeshurun. And by the way, this evening, I'll be teaching about the origins of Reform Judaism at 7 o'clock, and tomorrow evening, we'll have our adult Megillah reading, our adult Purim celebration, and you're welcome to come to that too. It's a lot of fun. Temple B'nai Jeshurun, 5101 Grand, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Shabbat